we could just be reading about one more incident where Jordan Neely just assaulted a bunch of people on that train, or hit someone, or stabbed someone, or who knows what. And then that would just be another article in the newspaper. And it didn't happen this time because someone decided to step in, which is a good thing.
Okay, see, speaking of real life examples where you do need to step in and get violent, in particular grappling and choking, there was an incident very well publicized a couple of weeks ago on the New York subway, involving a homeless man named Jordan Neely. He had long string of convictions. Like he wasn't mentally very well. And yeah, he was being aggressive on a subway car, shouting and screaming in people's faces, making violent threats. I think anyone's been on a New York subway at least a couple of times will have been in that situation. It's quite uncomfortable. You're literally trapped in a tube underneath the ground with them. That's great. So what happened here? The man was getting very aggressive and loud, and a former Marine stepped in, and others too, to be fair. Stepped in, grappled him, got his back on the ground, and ended up choking him. Got him in a rear naked choke, which eventually ended up killing him. Did you have any I don't know, kind of thoughts or breakdown on it? Given us your own.
I think you just gave a very good breakdown of why this event happened. Anybody that, like you said, anybody that's ridden the subway is probably, unfortunately, especially the last couple of years, because New York is one of those places that's descended into chaos and violence, thanks to very specific political policies that have been pushed through. You're in a very dangerous situation. The situation can be very scary. And my understanding of that particular incident, and I'm limited to the same information you are, what we get in the press, and there's a lot of questions I have, a lot more questions I have than answers about that. So we've only been given so much information about that the jury will see that we probably won't. But my understanding of that situation is by the time the Marine stepped in, along with, I think, 2 other men, one of whom was also Black, multiple people had dialed 911. Multiple people on that train had called the police because they were in fear of their life. And New Yorkers aren't quick to call the police, especially New Yorkers that ride the subway all the time. They see people taking a shit or stabbing someone, or like, that's just, okay, you're in New York. So when you have multiple people picking up their cell phone to dial 911, then this is somebody that truly is threatening other people. So I think actually, if we were living in a healthy society, that Marine would be given a medal. He wouldn't be being charged with homicide right now. The only reason he's being charged with homicide is because of his skin color. That's number one. Number two, I'm skeptical that the choke had anything to do with this man's death. My understanding was he is awake. He was awake. He had revived by the time they'd gotten to the next stop. People talk about him holding the choke for like, one article I heard, they were postulating that he held the choke for like 10 minutes. There isn't 10 minutes between stops in a New York subway. You're going to go one stop and a few minutes later you're at the next stop. And my understanding of the situation was by the time they'd gotten to the next stop, the officers were there waiting for him. He was awake. The suspect was awake, and then he died. And I suspect that, perhaps a drug overdose, perhaps excited delirium. There's different things that happen to people when they start to get real amped up and their blood pressure starts to go. And even if they're not on controlled substances, that can cause them to die. And I am skeptical that the choke had anything at all to do with his death. And the last thing I would say about that is the only photographs and video footage I've seen of that incident, he didn't even have a rear naked choke on him. He basically just had what we call a harness. He had back control and was holding him by the shoulders to prevent him from escaping. And you had, like you said, 2 other guys who haven't been charged at all, who were doing the same thing, restraining this guy. So this wasn't some vigilante that was acting alone and, took it upon himself trying to hurt someone. And I don't think it had anything to do with race. But unfortunately, I think the prosecution does. And so hopefully hopefully for everybody, we will see this guy exonerated, because it's going to send a really bad message through the entire country if he's not. And if you think people are slow to step in and help protect fellow citizens now, you just wait until you send somebody like this to jail, and it's going to be every man for himself out there in the streets.
Yeah, you mentioned about the race. Even the very initial the initial reporting, there was the usual race baiting crowd were trying to say they actually used the word lynching, like to compare it to compare it to any kind of lynching of in history is it's a massive disrespect to people who were. Yeah,
100%. And if this Marine was black, he would have never been prosecuted. It would have just,
you might not even know his name.
yeah.
In fact, actually, on that note, I think it was about a week or two after, okay, the Marine's name was Daniel Penny. I'm not sure if we mentioned
Daniel Penny, yeah.
that was Jordan Neely and Daniel Penny. But then about 2 or 3 weeks later, there was a young gentleman on the train with his girlfriend, and a crazed homeless person came through the thing, or came through the car, punched his girlfriend in the face, and then had a fight with Jordan Williams. Jordan Williams ended up stabbing him. I don't know whose knife it was, but he was I don't know what the term is, but it was deemed that he wasn't going to be charged.
Yeah,
attempt to
he
convict.
stabbed him. It was in my understanding, it wasn't even a weapon he was allowed to carry. Again, I'm not upset that he was exonerated. I think he should have been exonerated. He was obviously protecting himself. And sometimes in situations like that, you need to use tools. So I think from what I've read, he acted appropriately. But that's a great example. That's someone who actually then sought out the guy who hit his girlfriend, stabbed him and killed him, and then he's not brought up on charges and he's just released. It's a different jurisdiction. So that occurred in the Bronx, which is different from Manhattan, where they have a different district attorney where Daniel Penny is. So that's part of it. But we can't discount the fact that in that situation, both people were black. And
Yeah.
again, I think if he'd been, the circumstances had been different, then he very well may have been prosecuted too.
Right. Those both of those instances, and even just the occurrence of like the crazy homeless man who walks through the subway car shouting and screaming, most of the time, probably 99% of the time, it actually comes to nothing, and it's just everyone just has elevated heart rate, and then he fucks off and they kind of relax again. But there are situations that aren't quite as clear as a self-defense. Like in a self-defense situation, if someone's threatening you or about to attack you, then you go and you initiate or you match their violence. But in other situations, a subway, for example, someone else might be being victimized, and it's up to you to decide whether do I jump in, do I risk a fight with this person who might have a weapon or anything like that. That's right. a lot trickier of a situation, stepping in for someone else versus self-defense.
It is. And we like to think that we live in a world where people will do that. It's easy, Jordan Neely, the guy who the Marine had restrained, he had multiple arrests and convictions for randomly assaulting people. I think he broke an elderly woman's eye socket. So he had just walked up to her and punched her. So yeah, there's a lot of situations where some of these things amount for nothing, and it's just a homeless person being threatening and walking through and threatening everybody. And then there's a lot of situations every single day that happen all across the country where that same person's walking through threatening, and then all of a sudden they randomly attack and they'll punch an elderly, anybody that's basically vulnerable. They'll punch an elderly person or hurt a child or throw someone in front of a train, push them in front of a train. It's happened multiple times in New York where randomly somebody will just come and shove someone in front of a train. So you never know. And if you let someone who's being threatening get that close to you, where they're capable of doing that, you're making an error. So you either have to make distance and get away from that person, or you have to engage with them physically. But you don't want to leave it up to them as to whether or not they just decide to assault you, especially if you're someone that's more vulnerable, elderly person, or someone who's more apt to get hurt. So it's easy to forget how quickly these situations can completely change. And we could just be reading about one more incident where Jordan Neely just assaulted a bunch of people on that train, or hit someone, or stab someone, or who knows what. And then that would just be another article in the newspaper. And it didn't happen this time because someone decided to step in, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. We wouldn't want to get to a place some would argue that we're already there, but we wouldn't want to get to a place where like even a guy who considers himself like physically able would rather like turn a blind eye to someone being attacked than get involved himself. Again, talking about there was another video, I think it was during COVID or around about that time, but there's again a crazed homeless person comes through. I think this one just to for distinction was I think this one was dressed as a woman. You might remember the video. But anyway, came through being aggressive, kicking windows, sat down next to a woman, and she kind of turned and stood to get up, and he grabbed her by the back of by the ponytail and stood and held her. You know, she started crying. She was in distress. But in the video, you can see like 3 or 4 guys on the train. No one shouts. No one says anything. No one does anything. It's really easy. Like I certainly like to think that if I was there, at the very least, I'd shout or try to warn them off, and then maybe go. But it's easy to say if you're not there. You know.
That's right. Yeah, and that's one of those situations that's going to be made eternally worse if we wind up if that Alvin Bragg, the district attorney from Manhattan, winds up getting away with prosecuting this guy. That kind of thing is only going to get magnified, and the people who are hurt, people don't have a hard time wrapping their mind around this sometimes. But the people who get hurt most when those kind of things happen are exactly the kind of people that Alvin Bragg and others purport to help. The most vulnerable, the poorest, the most elderly, the weakest, the most frail. They are the ones that are going to suffer the most when you prosecute someone like that Marine for stepping in and protecting other people. Because there'll be nobody left to protect them except for police, who are few and far between these days.